Did you really think you belonged here, Leela? You look absolutely pathetic.
I can't believe she actually showed up.
Mrs. Caldwell is absolutely thrilled.
Chaos erupts in the grand Caldwell estate. See the drama unfold and subscribe to witness who truly controls the room.
Stand still. I want to see how filthy someone like you looks in real. Ethan Caldwell III sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance and cruel amusement. He held the crystal goblet high above Lila Winslow's head, the golden liquid catching the grand chandelier's light and scattering it like tiny, mocking stars over the guests gathered in the vast ballroom. 15 years old, barely more than a child herself, Lila's face was frozen in a mixture of shock and disbelief, but there was also a glimmer of defiance, almost imperceptible, in the way her chin lifted slightly despite the humiliation that was about to be inflicted upon her. Ethan's grin widened, sharp and predatory, the kind of grin that made everyone in the room shiver uncomfortably, even as they tried to hide it behind polite masks. The room smelled faintly of expensive perfumes, polished marble and tension, thick and suffocating as the aristocratic crowd leaned forward in collective anticipation, their gazes glued to the impending spectacle. Wine sloshed in the goblet as Ethan adjusted his hold, feeling the weight of it, feeling the control it gave him, and savoring every second of power. His golden cufflinks caught the light as he flexed his wrist, and the crowd, a mixture of family friends, business magnates, and social elites, remained silent except for the sharp intakes of breath that betrayed their fascination with the cruelty they were witnessing. Lila's gown, a pale blush silk with delicate lace along the collar and sleeves, seemed almost aglow under the chandeliers, the elegance of it contrasting violently with the imminent mess that would soon ruin it. Every detail of her attire, carefully chosen shoes, sparkling tiara, and even the faint scent of her perfume, seemed designed to amplify the drama, making Ethan's action not just an act of physical humiliation, but a deliberate desecration of beauty and dignity. "Do it, Ethan," whispered Vivian Caldwell, her hands clasped in front of her, face lighting up with approval, pride dancing in her eyes, as if this moment was a ritual she had longed to witness. Her applause rang out sharp, almost theatrical, cutting through the tense hush of the room. "Good boy," she encouraged, her voice rich with authority and condescension, as though she were handing down a command that the boy was fulfilling with utmost skill. Her smile was smug, satisfied, the kind of smile that could chill the air and make everyone around her feel complicit in the act of degradation about to unfold. In that moment, the bond between mother and son was solidified not by love, but by shared cruelty, a shared delight in asserting dominance over someone they deemed inferior. "Do it, Ethan," whispered Vivian Caldwell, her hands clasped in front of her, face lighting up with approval, pride dancing in her eyes, as if this moment was a ritual she had longed to witness. Her applause rang out sharp, almost theatrical, cutting through the tense hush of the room. "Good boy," she encouraged, her voice rich with authority and condescension, as though she were handing down a command that the boy was fulfilling with utmost skill. Her smile was smug, satisfied, the kind of smile that could chill the air and make everyone around her feel complicit in the act of degradation about to unfold. In that moment, the bond between mother and son was solidified not by love, but by shared cruelty, a shared delight in asserting dominance over someone they deemed inferior. Ethan's laugh rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the stunned silence. It was a sound of triumph, a sound of entitlement, the kind of laugh that demanded attention and acknowledgement of superiority. He watched her carefully, savoring every drip as if it were a reward for his patience and precision. Every drop that fell was a tiny victory, a mark of control over someone who dared to exist in his presence without submission. The crowd watched silently, some impressed, some horrified, some complicit in the cruel game that unfolded before them. Their reactions fed Ethan's self-importance, confirming the status he had long been trained to enjoy, an unchallenged heir to wealth, arrogance, and public spectacle. Vivian's clapping intensified, deliberate, precise, echoing off the marble floors and ornate walls. "Well done, Ethan," she said again, voice soft yet commanding, saturated with the kind of pride that makes one feel morally untouchable despite the obvious cruelty. Her approval was more intoxicating than the finest champagne, and Ethan basked in it, drinking it in with the same hunger with which he had poured the wine over Lila. He straightened his posture, raised his chin, and allowed himself a brief, arrogant bow to the audience, as though the performance had been meant not only for the girl, but for all eyes present, all witnesses to his dominance. Lila finally blinked, her lashes coated in crimson, her gown ruined, yet she held her posture, a quiet defiance hidden beneath the humiliation. The crowd could see it if they looked closely, a flicker of fire behind her drenched eyes, a promise that this was far from over. And yet, in that room filled with wealth, power, and expectation, it was Ethan who held the moment, who commanded attention, who defined the narrative. For now he was victorious, and the applause of Vivian Caldwell sealed it, a mother's pride entwined with societal cruelty in a single, unforgettable instant. The room buzzed with murmurs that whispered beneath the clinking of glasses and soft notes of the string quartet tucked into a corner of the grand ballroom. Even the chandeliers seemed to gleam with more intensity, as if the crystal itself relished the spectacle. Ethan Caldwell III's smirk had not faded. It had grown sharper, more dangerous, the kind of expression that made it clear he enjoyed not only the act, but the effect it had on everyone present. His golden hair was perfectly combed, catching the light in waves that added an almost angelic contrast to the viciousness etched across his youthful features. Yet, beneath the surface, there was the unmistakable gleam of entitlement, the kind ingrained through years of living in mansions, attending elite academies, and learning from parents who never shied away from demonstrating their power in public. Lila Winslow's dress, now drenched in crimson wine, clung to her like a second skin, and every fold, every delicate pleat, absorbed the chaos of the moment. She took a careful, measured step back, the slight shift in her balance enough to remind everyone that she was still alive, still standing, still human in a room that treated her as a spectacle. Her hair, dark and glossy, fell in disheveled waves over her shoulders, the liquid streaking it with a tinge of red that contrasted sharply with her pale skin. She tried to control her breathing, each inhale shallow, tight, but steady enough to mask the panic that threatened to rise. In those few seconds, she became a living painting of vulnerability and quiet defiance, a contradiction that drew the eyes of every observer. Vivian Caldwell, standing tall behind her son, clapped her hands together again, the sound crisp and commanding. "Bravo, Ethan. Absolutely perfect." Her high heels clicked against the marble floor as she shifted slightly, each movement exuding grace, wealth, and calculated indulgence in the spectacle. She turned slightly toward the guests, beaming, as if to say, "This is how we raise them, strong, decisive, unafraid to demonstrate superiority." Her eyes flicked to Lila with a mixture of disdain and amusement, enjoying the control her family wielded over those they deemed beneath them. It was a dangerous sort of approval, one that validated cruelty, a signal to the world that power was to be flaunted without restraint. The guests, of course, were a mixture of reactions. Some whispered among themselves, clutching their champagne flutes tightly, unsure if etiquette demanded a reaction or silence. A few younger attendees, barely old enough to understand the social rules at play, gawked openly, wide-eyed and horrified, yet secretly intrigued by the display. It was as though Ethan's act of humiliation had awakened a primal curiosity in everyone, forcing them to examine the raw, unfiltered dynamics of wealth and privilege. Some older men nodded subtly, acknowledging the precision with which Ethan had executed the act, while a few women exchanged polite glances that carried the faintest hint of shame, though none dared voice it aloud. In that moment, the room existed entirely in the orbit of Ethan Caldwell III's arrogance, and Lila Winslow's suffering became the lens through which everyone measured themselves. Ethan, sensing the shift in attention, allowed himself a brief, conceited smile, his gaze sweeping across the room. He felt powerful, alive, unstoppable. Each step he took was calculated, deliberate, an unspoken display that he was the center of this meticulously orchestrated universe. His hand brushed against the back of his blazer, ensuring every crease was perfect, every cufflink aligned, as if the perfection of his appearance somehow legitimized the cruelty he had just enacted. He caught Lila's eye for a fraction of a second, her dark eyes filled with a storm of emotions, shock, anger, and humiliation. But he did not falter. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, a mocking gesture of dominance, as if to remind her and the entire room that this was his world, at least for these moments, suspended in time. Meanwhile, Lila's mind raced even as her body remained still. She thought of her father, of the words he had whispered before leaving her to attend this gathering. Stand strong, no matter what they throw at you. Those words became her anchor, a lifeline of dignity in the sea of degradation. She clenched her fists subtly beneath the folds of her ruined gown, forcing herself to absorb the humiliation without showing a single tear, a single quiver, a single hint that Ethan Caldwell III's actions had any power over her spirit. Each drop of wine that soaked her dress became a symbol, not of weakness, but of endurance, a quiet rebellion that would later manifest in ways no one in this room could predict. Vivian Caldwell, ever the proud mother, continued to direct the show like a conductor of a symphony of arrogance. You've outdone yourself, Ethan. Truly exemplary. Her voice carried across the room, amplified by the acoustic perfection of the marble walls, and it was impossible not to hear. Every word, every gesture reinforced the hierarchy, cemented in the social order of wealth, power, and inherited entitlement. Guests shifted in their seats, some with admiration, some with discomfort, but none dared challenge the authority being displayed, the display of dominance that had been rehearsed over years of social conditioning. It was theater, yes, but theater with real stakes, real emotion, and real consequences, particularly for Lila Winslow, who now stood as both victim and focal point of everyone's attention. The atmosphere thickened, charged with anticipation and subtle tension, as Ethan lowered his goblet back to the table, every movement graceful, deliberate, and calculated to maximize the drama. Lila exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, masking the quiver in her shoulders, the sting in her eyes, and the humiliation that threatened to overwhelm her. The guests, now murmuring quietly, absorbed the aftermath, the red stain on the silk, the triumphant gleam in Ethan's eyes, and the subtle poise that Lila retained despite it all. It was a moment destined to be remembered, whispered about in private circles long after the event ended, a moment that defined not just the dynamics of wealth and privilege, but the resilience of those who found themselves at the mercy of it. The clinking of fine china and the soft murmur of polite conversation could not mask the tension that had settled like a heavy fog over the ballroom. Every eye remained fixed on Lila Winslow, whose once pristine blush gown now bore the dark stains of humiliation. Ethan Caldwell III, basking in the afterglow of his triumph, strode lightly across the polished marble floor, the sound of his shoes crisp and deliberate, like a drumbeat announcing his dominance. His every movement seemed choreographed, as if the entire event were designed to showcase not just his power, but the careful orchestration of wealth, privilege, and social superiority that his family had perfected over generations. The very air seemed to bend around him, charged with a mixture of fear, admiration, and subtle disgust from those present, creating an invisible halo of authority that no one dared challenge. Vivian Caldwell, standing just behind him, radiated pride that was almost tangible. Her posture was impeccable, her eyes bright with satisfaction as she observed the consequences of her son's actions. There was a calculated cruelty in her expression, a knowledge that she had groomed him not only to inherit wealth, but to wield it without hesitation, to assert dominance in any situation without remorse. She clapped her hands lightly, the sound sharp and precise, reinforcing the social hierarchy she so clearly relished. Every guest in the room could feel the weight of her approval, a silent declaration that Ethan's behavior was not only acceptable but exemplary. It was a cruel kind of mentorship, a lesson in power dressed as maternal pride, and it was as mesmerizing as it was horrifying. Lila's dark eyes, wide and unwavering, reflected the chandelier lights like mirrors to her inner turmoil. Her heart pounded violently, each beat a reminder of her helplessness in this gilded prison. Yet beneath the humiliation, a spark of defiance lingered, subtle and almost invisible to the untrained eye. It was in the way she stood tall despite the wine-soaked fabric clinging to her body, in the faint lift of her chin, and in the quiet steadiness of her breathing. She refused to allow herself to crumble completely, to provide Ethan and Vivian Caldwell with the ultimate satisfaction of watching her break. Each second that passed, each glance that met Ethan's triumphant gaze, strengthened the resolve simmering quietly within her. The humiliation was public, undeniable, yet her spirit remained intact, a hidden fire waiting for its moment to ignite. Guests whispered among themselves, their voices low, careful not to draw the ire of the powerful family dominating the room. Some exchanged subtle glances, a flicker of sympathy or perhaps recognition of injustice passing between them, though none dared act. The unspoken rules of wealth and privilege were clear. No one could intervene, no one could challenge the hierarchy, and certainly no one could risk offending Ethan Caldwell III or his formidable mother. The room was a carefully maintained ecosystem, each person aware of their place within it, and Lila Winslow, for all her grace and poise, had been cast deliberately into the role of outsider, a cautionary example of what happened to those who dared cross invisible boundaries. Ethan, feeling the weight of every gaze upon him, allowed himself a small, self-satisfied smirk. He adjusted the cuff of his perfectly tailored blazer, the fabric smooth and pristine despite the chaos he had created moments before. The crystal goblets still glinted faintly on the table beside him, a silent testament to the power he wielded and the spectacle he had orchestrated with deliberate precision. He turned slightly to survey the crowd, his movements commanding attention, asserting dominance without a word. Every gesture, every glance, every subtle tilt of his head was a performance in control, a reminder to the room that he, and by extension his family, was untouchable. Vivian Caldwell's applause rang out again, deliberate and pointed, echoing off the high ceilings. Absolutely perfect, Ethan. You handled that with finesse. Her voice carried authority, a clear signal to the room that she sanctioned every action, every ounce of humiliation inflicted. She tilted her head toward Lila, a faint, calculating smile playing across her lips, as if to say, this is exactly how it should be. The elegance of her posture, the precision of her movements, and the quiet confidence of her approval made it clear that the act was not just Ethan's alone. It was a culmination of the family's strategy, a social lesson in dominance and submission dressed in the trappings of wealth and power. Lila, though drenched and visibly shaken, did not let her composure slip entirely. She inhaled slowly, deliberately, as though she were measuring each breath, each heartbeat, against the storm raging inside her. Her hands, delicate and trembling slightly, were hidden within the folds of her gown, concealing the small but significant fists of defiance she clenched beneath the fabric. Her mind raced, thinking of the steps she would take later, the careful planning required to reclaim her dignity, to turn this moment of public disgrace into a private victory that none of them would see coming. Though outwardly she appeared defeated, inwardly a quiet, simmering strength began to take shape, one that promised that this humiliation would not define her, would not break her spirit. The atmosphere remained charged, the guests caught between fascination and discomfort, unable to fully reconcile their admiration for the precision of Ethan Caldwell III's actions with the undeniable cruelty they had just witnessed. The chandeliers above reflected the tension, their crystals scattering light across the room like shards of clarity in a haze of social power and manipulation. Every movement, every glance, every subtle shift in posture was analyzed, interpreted, and stored in the memories of those present. Lila Winslow, once a symbol of innocence and grace, had become an unwilling focal point, a character in a living tableau of wealth, power, and unrelenting cruelty. Yet the quiet fire in her eyes hinted that this story was far from over, that the scales of power might one day shift in ways that no one in the room could predict. Ethan Caldwell III leaned casually against the marble balustrade of the grand staircase, his posture relaxed, almost languid, yet every muscle betrayed an innate readiness, a poised alertness cultivated over years of privilege and expectation. The crystal chandelier above cast fragmented reflections across his sharp features, highlighting the faint glint of mischief in his eyes and the subtle, predatory curve of his smile. He surveyed the guests with a detached air, as if they were mere accessories to his display, background actors in the meticulously constructed scene of humiliation he had orchestrated. His gaze, however, returned repeatedly to Lila Winslow, whose soaked gown clung like a second skin to her delicate frame, marking the stark contrast between his calculated confidence and her carefully restrained indignation. Each step she took, measured and deliberate, echoed against the marble floors like a quiet defiance, a reminder that even in public shame, some dignity could remain unbroken. Vivian Caldwell stood nearby, her posture the embodiment of aristocratic composure. Every gesture she made was precise, as though choreographed to reinforce the narrative she and her son had authored. Her eyes followed Ethan with pride, approval etched into the lines of her face, yet they also flicked to Lila with an almost clinical curiosity, as though cataloging the young girl's reactions for study, analysis, and future reference. "You've truly outdone yourself, Ethan," she murmured under her breath, not for the crowd, but for him alone, a private seal of recognition for the cruelty they both so clearly appreciated. Her hands, adorned with diamond-studded bracelets, rested lightly at her sides, a poised frame for the subtle performance of dominance that unfolded at every glance. She radiated an authority that seemed almost tangible, a gravitational pull that kept the room tethered to her will. Lila Winslow, though visibly drenched and shocked, did not break. Each breath she drew was measured, each flicker of emotion tightly controlled, as if she were performing her own quiet rebellion. Her eyes, dark and alert, scanned the room, noting expressions, whispers, and the subtle nods of approval that reinforced the hierarchy she found herself trapped within. Despite the humiliation, there was a thread of calculation weaving through her panic, a strategic patience that suggested this moment, though painful, was only one act in a longer narrative. The wine staining her gown, the stinging cold against her skin, and the collective gaze of hundreds of observers could not penetrate the inner resolve she had cultivated silently for years. Every humiliating second became a lesson, a test, a challenge to endure, and in that endurance lay her small, quiet victory. Guests, perched in their elaborate chairs and leaning against gilded walls, exchanged furtive glances, caught between fascination and discomfort. Some whispered cautiously to one another, their words laced with judgment, fear, or reluctant admiration for Ethan's audacity. Others simply stared, frozen by the interplay of wealth, entitlement, and cruelty that unfolded before them. Social etiquette dictated restraint, a careful balance between acknowledgement of the spectacle and maintenance of decorum. Yet beneath the polished veneer of civility, the unspoken truth resonated. This was more than a social display. It was a calculated assertion of power, a deliberate lesson in the consequences of crossing boundaries set by those born into privilege. Lila's suffering, though immediate and tangible, became a mirror reflecting the fragility of those who dared challenge or disrupt this hierarchy. Ethan's movements remained deliberate, each step echoing authority. He adjusted his cufflinks again, the metal catching the chandelier light like tiny beacons of precision and control. His smirk deepened as he noted the reactions around him, the barely concealed envy, the murmurs of disapproval tempered by fear, and the wide-eyed awe of younger guests who had never witnessed such a display of dominance firsthand. Every glance he received reinforced his sense of invincibility, a validation of the lessons instilled by generations of Caldwell upbringing. His voice, when it finally spoke, was calm and unhurried, carrying through the high-ceilinged room without raising, yet demanding attention. "Careful, Lila," he said lightly, almost teasing. "The night has only just begun." The words were both playful and threatening, a reminder of the ongoing control he wielded. Vivian Caldwell's presence was a constant, anchoring Ethan's performance while amplifying its impact. Her slight tilt of the head, her subtle gestures, even the rhythm of her applause, all communicated reinforcement of his dominance. "He knows exactly what he's doing," she whispered to a nearby acquaintance, her voice soft yet filled with pride. "Precision, timing, poise. That is how you command respect." The words, though spoken quietly, carried the weight of authority, underscoring that the act was not impulsive cruelty, but a learned, deliberate assertion of control perfected over years of practice. The room, ever attentive, absorbed this silent instruction, reinforcing the invisible hierarchy that governed every interaction. Lila Winslow's mind raced even as she maintained her outward calm. She cataloged every detail: the positioning of Ethan's feet, the subtle shift in Vivian's expression, the whispers of the guests, as if preparing a mental map of strategies, weaknesses, and opportunities. Humiliation, she realized, could be endured, survived, and later leveraged. Each droplet of wine, each cold shiver, each weight of expectation from hundreds of eyes became fuel for resilience, sharpening her awareness and resolve. In that gilded, suffocating ballroom, where wealth and arrogance collided with innocence and defiance, Lila found an internal sanctuary, a place where dignity remained intact, even as her body bore the stain of public shame. The tension in the room seemed to thicken with every passing second, a living thing that wrapped itself around guests and participants alike. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, reflecting light across the polished marble, scattering patterns across walls, floors, and the expressions of everyone present. Every movement of Ethan Caldwell III, every approving glance from Vivian Caldwell, and every subtle gesture of Lila Winslow became magnified in the high-stakes theater of wealth and cruelty. This moment, carefully orchestrated and terrifyingly precise, would linger in memory long after the wine had dried, the gowns had been changed, and the guests had departed. It was a tableau of power, privilege, and defiance, and each participant, willing or unwilling, played their role in a narrative that was far from over. The murmurs of the guests had grown louder, though still carefully modulated, a symphony of polite curiosity, faint horror, and unspoken admiration that filled the cavernous ballroom. Ethan Caldwell III, standing at the top of the grand staircase, allowed the faintest trace of a smile to tug at his lips. It was not a casual smile. It was precise, predatory, and entirely deliberate, a silent message to everyone watching that he was fully aware of the effect he had created and reveled in it. His eyes, sharp and calculating, swept across the crowd like a hawk scanning a forest floor, noting each flicker of emotion, each subtle gesture, and each almost imperceptible reaction to the performance he had orchestrated. Lila Winslow, drenched in crimson-stained silk, stood in stark contrast to his composed dominance, yet there was something in the tilt of her chin, the steadiness of her gaze, that hinted at an inner fire Ethan had yet to fully comprehend. Vivian Caldwell, standing just a few paces behind her son, exuded an aura of maternal authority that amplified the tension in the room. Her hands rested lightly at her sides, adorned with jewels that sparkled faintly in the chandelier light, each diamond catching a fragment of the drama below. She clapped once, deliberately, the sound cutting through the murmurs and silence like a knife, drawing attention not just to her son's actions, but to her own approval of them. "Remarkable, Ethan," she murmured, almost to herself, though her words were carried by the acoustics of the grand hall to reach the guests who listened closely. The statement was simple, yet it carried immense weight. It was an endorsement of cruelty, of calculated humiliation, and of the social dominance that the Caldwell family so expertly wielded. Lila's breathing remained steady, though every muscle in her body was tense beneath the silk gown. Her hands, hidden within the folds of fabric, clenched tightly at her sides as she maintained the appearance of calm, carefully controlling every micro-expression so that the audience would see her not as broken, but as enduring. There was a quiet strategy in her stillness, a deliberate patience that contrasted sharply with Ethan's overt arrogance. Each gasp, each whispered comment from the crowd, became a tool in her internal calculation, a way to measure the psychology of her observers, to identify weaknesses, and to prepare for the eventual moment when she could reclaim her dignity. Every drop of wine that had soaked her delicate silk became not a mark of shame, but a testament to her resilience, a reminder that humiliation could be absorbed, endured, and transformed into quiet strength. Guests shifted uneasily in their seats, caught between the spectacle and their sense of decorum. Some nodded subtly to one another, acknowledging the precision of Ethan's actions, while others lowered their eyes, unable to reconcile the apparent cruelty with their own values. The young and impressionable, particularly those who had been raised in the same gilded environment, but without Ethan's absolute confidence, stared in a mixture of fear and fascination, unsure whether to admire his control or pity Lila's predicament. It was a complex tableau, an intricate dance of social power, where every glance, every reaction, and every whisper reinforced the unspoken rules that governed the room. Lila Winslow, though the apparent victim, was also the central figure of this social experiment, her responses studied as keenly as the actions of her aggressor. Ethan's every movement was deliberate, designed to maximize both spectacle and intimidation. He adjusted the cuff of his perfectly tailored blazer, brushed imaginary dust from his shoulder, and allowed his gaze to linger on Lila for a fraction longer than necessary, ensuring that everyone could see the subtle display of dominance. His voice, when he finally spoke, was measured, calm, and teasing, carrying across the room without raising, yet heavy with authority. "Careful, Lila," he said, his tone light, almost playful, yet the underlying threat was unmistakable. "You wouldn't want to miss the rest of the evening." The statement hung in the air, a reminder that the power dynamics at play were ongoing, that the performance was far from over, and that he held control over not just this moment, but the psychological landscape of the entire room. Vivian Caldwell's approval was constant, subtle yet unmistakable. A slight nod here, a quiet murmur there. A delicate smile played across her lips, each gesture reinforcing Ethan's authority and the lesson in social hierarchy being delivered in real time. "He understands the world already," she whispered to a nearby guest, her tone calm, almost scholarly, yet laced with pride. Precision, timing, composure. That is how a Caldwell commands attention and respect. The words, though soft, carried authority, echoing through the room in subtle ways that influenced every observer, embedding the lesson of dominance, privilege, and control deeper into the fabric of the gathering. Lila, though outwardly composed, continued to measure, plan, and strategize. Every subtle detail of Ethan's performance, every nuance in Vivian's gestures, and every reaction of the guests was stored carefully in her mind. The humiliation she had endured, the cold shock of wine-soaked silk, the weight of hundreds of observing eyes, all of it was now data, fuel for a plan that would allow her to reclaim dignity and assert control when the time was right. Inwardly, a quiet determination grew stronger, a fire kindled by the injustice, humiliation, and audacity of the display. Though Ethan Caldwell III and Vivian Caldwell believed they had orchestrated a perfect evening of domination and spectacle, Lila Winslow had already begun the slow, deliberate process of turning this moment into a personal triumph that would ultimately escape their control. The atmosphere remained electric, each subtle sound, the soft clink of a glass, the rustle of silk, the murmur of whispered commentary, amplifying the tension and reinforcing the social hierarchy being displayed. Chandeliers glittered above, scattering fractured light across the polished marble floors, the sparkling reflections adding a surreal beauty to the harshness of the scene. Every detail, every nuance, every carefully executed movement reinforced the notion that the Caldwell family's control extended beyond wealth, into psychology, perception, and social dominance. Yet even amidst this overwhelming power, Lila Winslow stood as a quiet counterpoint, her endurance and poise silently defying the spectacle, hinting that the evening's drama was far from finished, and that the scales of power might one day shift in ways that no one in the room could predict. The murmur of the crowd had not subsided. Instead, it deepened into a low hum of fascination, fear, and subtle envy, wrapping the entire grand ballroom in a thick, almost tangible tension. Ethan Caldwell III moved with deliberate ease, each motion precise, rehearsed, and undeniably commanding. He walked along the edge of the balcony, one hand lightly brushing against the polished mahogany railing, the other adjusting the cuff of his tailored sleeve with almost ritualistic perfection. The chandeliers above caught the movement of his every gesture, scattering fractured light across the marble floors and gilded walls, transforming the room into a kaleidoscope of power, wealth, and societal spectacle. Lila Winslow, her crimson-stained gown clinging to her delicate form, remained rooted in place, her gaze steady despite the cold shock of the wine that still dampened her hair and skin. Every observer could see the contrast, Ethan's confidence, polished and unyielding, against her quiet, simmering resistance, creating a tension that was as exquisite as it was unsettling. Vivian Caldwell, standing near the base of the staircase with an air of composure that was both maternal and authoritative, continued to oversee the tableau with unwavering attention. Her hands, adorned with sparkling diamond bracelets, rested lightly at her sides. Yet every subtle gesture seemed calibrated to maximize the effect of Ethan's display. A slight tilt of her head, a deliberate narrowing of her eyes, the soft curve of her lips, all communicated silent approval and reinforced the power dynamics at play. "He is extraordinary," she murmured to a nearby acquaintance, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of authority that could not be ignored. Every word was measured, every gesture precise, ensuring that her son's actions were not seen as impulsive cruelty, but as the execution of a meticulously crafted lesson in dominance, poise, and societal control. Lila Winslow's mind raced as she fought to maintain her composure. Each breath she drew was controlled, each heartbeat a measured pulse in a body that refused to betray weakness. The weight of hundreds of observing eyes bore down on her, yet she internalized it, cataloging every reaction, every flicker of expression, and every subtle gesture. The cold, wet silk against her skin, the smell of wine, and the sting of humiliation became tools for focus, sharpening her awareness and fortifying her resolve. Though the room framed her as a victim, Lila silently rejected that label. Inwardly, she was not broken. She was calculating, enduring, and quietly plotting a response that would one day shift the balance of power entirely in her favor. Guests, caught between fascination and polite horror, continued to whisper and shift uneasily. Some attempted to reconcile their discomfort with admiration for Ethan Caldwell III's flawless execution of social dominance. Others glanced at Lila with sympathy, though they dared not voice it, aware of the risks inherent in contradicting the expectations of wealth and power so rigidly displayed in the room. The tension was a living entity, threading through every conversation, every glance, every subtle movement, binding the participants in a collective acknowledgement of both cruelty and hierarchy. Lila's suffering, though immediate and visible, became a silent lesson to the onlookers, a reminder that in this world, control was wielded with precision, and those unprepared to navigate it could quickly find themselves exposed. Ethan's calculated performance continued, every step and gesture reinforcing his dominance. He allowed his gaze to linger on Lila for just long enough to unsettle her without overplaying it, a skill honed through years of observing, learning, and practicing the subtle art of intimidation. Each movement was choreographed to maintain attention, the faint smirk that played at the corner of his lips signaling the pleasure he derived from the meticulous orchestration of the evening. He was the embodiment of entitlement and control, a young man groomed to wield both with precision, his confidence bolstered by the constant, approving presence of Vivian Caldwell. The audience, fully aware of this dynamic, responded with a mixture of awe, fear, and admiration, creating a collective energy that amplified every moment of the unfolding drama. Vivian Caldwell's subtle reinforcement of her son's performance was relentless and elegant. A light clap here, a slight nod there, and a murmured word of praise served to magnify Ethan's presence and assert the social hierarchy with absolute clarity. "He understands the weight of power," she whispered to a confidant nearby, her voice calm and deliberate. "Every gesture, every word, every glance, it is all calculated, perfected." Her approval was more than maternal pride. It was an unspoken lesson to the entire room, a silent instruction in dominance and societal command that few could resist internalizing. The elegance of her posture, combined with the sharpness of her gaze, created an almost gravitational pull that kept all attention tethered firmly to the Caldwell family, reinforcing the message that power was absolute, inherited, and exercised without apology. Lila Winslow's inner resilience continued to grow as she maintained her external composure. Each second of humiliation, each splash of wine that marred her gown, each whispered murmur of the crowd became fuel for her strategy. She studied Ethan's posture, the subtleties of Vivian's gestures, and the responses of the observers, storing every detail as data. Her mind turned the chaos into order, the public spectacle into preparation, and the overwhelming presence of power into a quiet motivation. Though she appeared the subject of dominance and humiliation, internally she was assembling the pieces of her own countermeasure, a plan that would allow her to reclaim agency in ways the room could not yet anticipate. The room itself seemed alive, the polished marble, the gleaming chandeliers, and the rich tapestries all reflecting the tension, power, and psychological complexity of the moment. Every flicker of light, every whispered conversation, and every gesture reinforced the intricate balance of dominance, submission, and observation. Ethan Caldwell III and Vivian Caldwell may have believed that this evening had established unshakable control, yet Lila Winslow's quiet determination, carefully concealed beneath her drenched exterior, hinted at the eventual tipping of the scales. The public display of humiliation was only one chapter. The story of resilience, strategy, and eventual retribution was already being written in the quiet calculations of the girl they underestimated. The tension in the grand ballroom reached its peak, a palpable, almost suffocating weight that settled over every guest as if the walls themselves were aware of the drama unfolding within them. Ethan Caldwell III, perched atop the grand staircase like a young king surveying his court, allowed himself a brief, self-satisfied smile. Every eye in the room followed him with a mixture of awe, fear, and reluctant admiration, each guest acutely aware of the power he wielded not just through wealth, but through psychological precision, composure, and the carefully cultivated presence of absolute dominance. The golden chandeliers above reflected in the polished marble floors, scattering fractured light across the room like shards of brilliance, each shard magnifying the intensity of the moment. Lila Winslow, still drenched in crimson-stained silk, stood her ground at the center of the floor, her posture a paradoxical blend of humility and quiet defiance. Her gaze, steady and unwavering, met Ethan's with a subtle intensity that suggested a fire within, a spark that had not been extinguished despite the public humiliation she had endured. Vivian Caldwell's presence behind her son amplified the aura of authority and control that defined the room. Her gestures were deliberate and measured, an approving nod, a faint smile, a slow clap that echoed lightly off the marble walls, each movement reinforcing Ethan's dominance and signaling the audience to acknowledge the hierarchy without question. "Absolutely flawless," she murmured softly, not for the entire room, but with enough resonance to reach those paying attention. Her words were a subtle lesson in power, a validation of her son's actions, and an unmistakable sign that the Caldwell family's social influence extended beyond mere wealth into the very psychology of those who observe them. Each approving glance she cast seemed to bind the room tighter in the web of social control, emphasizing that this moment was not a simple display of cruelty, but a meticulously orchestrated performance, a testament to the family's mastery of influence and perception. Lila Winslow, despite the cold shock of the wine against her skin and the heavy weight of humiliation pressing down from hundreds of watching eyes, maintained a quiet composure that spoke volumes to anyone paying close attention. Each controlled breath, each slight adjustment of her posture, and the faint glimmer of defiance in her gaze were subtle but potent signs that, while outward appearances suggested defeat, inwardly she was resolute. Her mind raced, cataloging every reaction, every murmur, every approving nod from Vivian Caldwell, and every flicker of admiration, discomfort, or envy among the guests. The humiliation, though undeniable, became a lens through which she sharpened her awareness, honed her strategy, and prepared to reclaim not only dignity, but agency in ways that had yet to unfold. Each drop of wine, each glimmer of reflected light across her soaked gown, and every whisper in the room became data, information that would one day guide her next moves in this high-stakes social battlefield. Guests, caught in the spell of the performance, continued to murmur and glance among themselves, balancing politeness with fascination. Some dared not look directly at the scene, fearful of implicating themselves or drawing attention to their discomfort, while others studied the minutiae of the Caldwell family's dynamics with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Ethan's precise posture, the confidence radiating from his every movement, and the subtle reinforcement of his mother's approval created a tableau of authority that few could resist internalizing. The social lesson being taught was unspoken yet unmistakable. Power, when executed with grace and precision, commanded both attention and compliance, and humiliation, when administered strategically, became an instrument of dominance rather than mere cruelty. Lila Winslow, though positioned as the object of that dominance, was actively observing, analyzing, and planning, quietly subverting the intended narrative from within. Ethan, sensing the subtle undercurrents of resistance in Lila's gaze, allowed his smirk to grow slightly, enjoying the tension without overplaying it. Every small gesture, the tilt of his head, the calculated sweep of his eyes across the guests, the deliberate precision with which he adjusted his cuff, was designed to sustain both his authority and the theater of power in which he thrived. Yet even as he asserted control, a faint, almost imperceptible awareness flickered across his expression, a whisper of recognition that Lila's defiance was not fully extinguished. He brushed it off quickly, confident in the moment, yet the seed of a psychological duel had been planted, and it would grow quietly in the shadows, outside the immediate view of the room. Vivian Caldwell's influence continued to anchor the scene, her presence a subtle but undeniable reinforcement of authority. Her gestures, measured and elegant, spoke volumes without words. Every tilt of her head, every faint curve of her lips, and every delicate movement of her hands directed the room's attention, maintaining the hierarchy she and her son embodied. Precision and control, she whispered softly to a confidant nearby. That is how you command respect. Observe and learn. Her words were not merely about Ethan's actions. They were a demonstration of the sophistication of inherited authority, a quiet reinforcement that social dominance was cultivated, deliberate, and performative. The audience, whether consciously or not, absorbed the lesson, the dynamics, and the intricate psychology woven into the evening's unfolding drama. Inside, Lila Winslow continued to build her silent resistance, quietly transforming the humiliation into resilience. Each gaze from the guests, every approving glance from Vivian Caldwell, and the subtle dominance displayed by Ethan were all carefully noted and filed within her mind. The experience, though painful and public, became a training ground for awareness, strategy, and patience. Her composure, though delicate in appearance, was steel beneath the silk, a promise that the narrative of power could be challenged and reshaped over time. Even as she stood drenched and scrutinized, she was already calculating the steps required to reclaim dignity, to regain control, and to turn the lessons of this evening into tools of empowerment. The chandeliers above scattered fractured light across the room, highlighting the drama in every reflection, every polished surface, and every subtle gesture. The polished marble floors mirrored the tension, the elegance of wealth, and the quiet yet potent psychological battle unfolding between Ethan Caldwell III and Lila Winslow. The guests, though participants in the spectacle, were also observers of a more intricate and silent contest, one that was not merely about wealth or cruelty, but about intelligence, strategy, and resilience. In this room of privilege, power, and social expectation, the evening's performance had ended, yet its consequences, both visible and hidden, had only just begun. Lila Winslow's quiet determination, Ethan Caldwell III's calculated dominance, and Vivian Caldwell's strategic reinforcement together created a story that would ripple through the minds of every witness long after the chandeliers dimmed and the guests departed.